My name is Piotr Matczak. I am from the academic part. I work at Faculty of Sociology at the Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Poland. You may be surprised because of my affiliation, which is not hydrological one or whatever type. But I work with flood issues and environmental issues for a long time. I had the luck to be engaged to the water issues by Professor Mickiewicz, and I have been working with him for a long time, publishing several papers with this master of science in the hydrological field, really globally recognized person. So it was a privilege for me to work with him. And my occupation is on the social, or more strictly speaking, institutional aspect of floods. You can now think what on earth is this institutional aspect. In short, I will describe this in my presentation, but in short, it's what people do collectively, not individually, but collectively. And concerning the floods, people act usually in accordance to certain patterns, and I'm working with that. The title is From Living with Flood to Flood Protection and Back, and my presentation will present in a certain historical perspective how people deal with floods. So I will show that it changes, and I will also try to challenge what we could see. I will start with the rivers, then flood risk a little bit. I will read probably some slides on that. Then human-water interactions, flood losses, which is the major aspect of floods for humans. Then I will talk about flood risk governance paradigms, which is the main topic of my presentation. I will refer a little bit to resilience, and I will try to discuss a little bit what's the future of flood risk management. But before I start, I am on the academic part, as I mentioned, and I was very glad to see to speak to such a team of motivated people concerned with the environment, and I looked at the list of participants, and most of you are people really devoted to the environment, but from various parts, so also NGOs. But looking at the names, I noticed one, that is Valerie Kendall, who is here. And because from my statistical part of my work, the Kendall's tau is used in statistics analysis, the rank correlation coefficient, which some of you may know. Personally, I don't think I have ever applied it. It's a little bit old-fashioned now, but in any case, I discussed with Valerie, and this is not her production. but the coincidence of the names was very nice. And then going back to my presentation, I will propose three theses, so to speak. First of all, that flood risk governance is not purely hydrological matter. Second thesis is that the current flood risk governance, which was nicely and shortly presented at the film, which we could see, is recalling the pre-modern measures, which once upon a time, I will show some 150 years ago were used. So in a way, we are trying to do the impossible, to go back to the times where much more nature-based solutions were much more applied. And finally, referring to that, the current flood risk governance paradigm, the style of thinking about flood risk management, which we try to enforce now, is not the last one. So we rather, and maybe this meeting is also for that, should think what's going to happen next. Okay, so this will be my cross-cutting issues in my presentation. And first, I will start with rivers. Why rivers are so crucial in terms of our life, our economy, but also the risks it entails. These are rivers made the civilization. It's a very simplistic, of course, statement, but indeed the beginning of human societies, developed societies, are connected with rivers, and you of course know the beginning of civilization, Tigris, Euphrates, in Yellow River, and in India and other parts of the world. And that is because of the agriculture, of transportation, trade, etc. And the rivers and water management were inevitably connected to the beginning of civilization and the development. Within some last thousands of years, rivers were very much connected with living of the societies. It involves a lot of use of rivers, functionalities, so to speak. So navigation was, of course, related to trade and of course, agriculture, but also military. Now we have a war in Ukraine, so maybe that's the good reference point, which may be not so obvious some years ago, but now back is possible to see it. And I discussed it with Higori, which I just left, but defending of Kiev some 2 months ago was possible because of flooding. It was artificially destroyed a dam, and a certain area was flooded, and it was easier to defend the city. So it was a very much historic reference, and of course, living close to river has disadvantages, and high level of water is simply dangerous, which is quite obvious. So floods is something inevitably connected with living close to rivers, and that is causing damage, property loss, and loss of lives. And there are some floods where hundreds of, in China, some at least thousands of people died. People always try to avoid that, and one of the early methods to deal with risk were to install flood signs. And this picture is from Poznań, from my city, and in the old market, which is quite similar to the one in Poznań, by the way. This plate is a plate signing the flood from 1036, so some 300 years ago. And I'm sure if you had a little bit of interest in your cities, such or similar signs could be found. There are sometimes on the bank of the river with stones, or simply on buildings. And why these are for? There are, of course, several functions, but one is to remember that the river is dangerous, and in a certain moment of time, it can be back again to a certain level. And in Poznań, in fact, in my city, there are several such signs on various levels. And of course, it's really a method to keep the collective memory of the danger of water. So it's not a sophisticated method of working with floods. With time, the method of dealing with water started to be more advanced, and it is thousands of methods how to deal with relocation, building levees, channels, reservoirs, dams. And I would like to emphasize the invention of cement, which now is not a good guy in terms of thinking on water management and flood risk management. We try to avoid it, in fact. But looking in the historical perspective, it's relatively new. It is the end of 19th century, in fact, more beginning of 20th century, when it started to be massively used in constructing various infrastructural parts related to flood risk management. And that was a major change, in fact, because that allowed for quick, strong infrastructural protection. And that's important because that is technology. And in fact, available technology is quite important when we think on dealing with floods. I will refer to the definition of flood risk, but I will not. It was mentioned already on Monday, so I will not describe that. But three components are important for flood risk: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. That relates to the hydrological part, the discharge, the level of water, the amount of water, etc. Exposure is, in short, the welfare. So if the country is, or the area is full of very expensive buildings, the losses are incredibly high, so the risk is high. Several years ago, I was participating in a project, and we took the city of London as a case. If it is flooded, and it's possible that it will be a total disaster for the whole global economy, because all the major banks, investment funds, etc., they have their servers there, and all the infrastructure. So there are places where the exposure is very high, but if you have abandoned land, the exposure is low. And finally, vulnerability, a very contested concept. I will, in short, refer to that as a human capabilities to deal with risk. So whether people are aware, whether they are prepared, they know what to do, if they have appropriate methods to react and to prepare for floods. And as a result of the combination of these, we have the risk. So something which can happen and cause negative consequences. In fact, it is much more complicated. These were three components, but I will refer to social hydrology. This is a concept developed in the last 15 years. It started by hydrologists, which were dissatisfied with their models. And they noticed that the models work, they are more sophisticated, they work fine in theory, but still there was visible deficiencies. So they decided that the social aspect needs to be included into the system, and they established a systemic view, which flooding covered by hydrology is one part of the wider system where we have, it is called geopolitics, but it is related to distance. Distance means whether people build something close to the river or further, depending on the policies and regulations, etc. We have also awareness, the societal part. Awareness means that people are easily forgetting about floods. We are such creatures that bad memories we try to not to think about, to remove from our memory, and flood is such. That is a really problem for flood risk management, because people don't, after a while, don't care. Then we have technology, which I mentioned, and economy, how wealthy the society is. That means wealthy in terms of exposure, bigger risk, but wealthy means also resources for preparation. And social hydrology looks how society alters the hydrological regime. So what is the impact of human activity on the hydrological regime? So the rivers, in short, but also how water regimes and hydrological extremes shape societies. It's sometimes constant floods results in abandoning certain areas, for example. As in history, it happened several times. To make it more complicated, society acts collectively. So it is not individuals' decision what to do, but eventually, as usually floods hit groups of people, they cannot cope individually. They have to cooperate, and that is difficult, very difficult. And I will take as my example, one of the two examples, Japan. There are two reasons for that. One is that there is a very nice paper by two Japanese authors on that, and also Japan is relatively distant from our country's work. What is here is maybe slightly complicated picture. It is the symbolic representation of the changes in one river, which is called Tone River, going through Tokyo to Tokyo Bay and Pacific Ocean, and that is from 1900 to 2006. So how it alters within more or less almost exactly 100 years. So it started, these numbers are discharged, and it's not maybe so much important, except the fact that these numbers are increasing. So we have a relatively simple river with additional river coming tributary and discharged to Tokyo Bay and Pacific Ocean in 1900. Then it starts to be complicated. There are additional channels. You can see there are two more. It starts to be a little bit more complicated with the time. Here, 1949, and further it starts to be even more complicated with more discharge, more flow. It represents how people alter the hydrological regime, the rivers themselves. Japan is a specific case because you of course know that Japan has very limited space for living, despite the country is big, but the area which is inhabitable is small, so they have to be very careful how to use this space. So they indeed put a lot of effort in organizing the space, and it is visible here. Similar cases we can find in many other countries, Hungary, and that is the Tisza River, and which also show the interaction between society and the water regime. This is the river coming from Romania through Ukraine, Hungary, and going through Serbia to Danube. In Hungary, it was a large floodplain. One third of the country was in a century covered every year by flood. That was the river which had a very large floodplain. What happened at the end of 19th century, there was a called Warsaw plan. That was a plan to use this area for agriculture production. Earlier it was sparsely populated and based on fishery, mostly using the flooding for production of fish and a little bit of agriculture production. So it had an opportunity to increase the productivity, and indeed the whole area was largely altered. So the river was shortened by 1/3 of the area length. 80% of the floodplains were cultivated, and traditional agriculture based on fishery was replaced by crops production, and the river was used for transportation. And it worked. So indeed, it brought a large increase of productivity, but only for some 50, 70 years. Then there was an incremental decrease of production and floods. And floods are on Tisza River is a major problem for Hungary till now. You can easily imagine that if you shorten a river length by 2/3, then it's inevitable. There are attempts to restore these floodplains, but it can be only done on a very limited scale because these areas are already used for 70 or 100 years for their purposes. Of course, you could see in your countries and in many other places similar examples, even more spectacular, how people changed the rivers. That is bringing welfare, which is obvious, but at the same time it brings increase of flood losses. These are the data from last year. And the biggest natural catastrophes last year, first it was hurricane in the US and Canada, and the second one is the European floods. You surely remember in Germany and other countries. Then we have winter storm, and then another flood in China, and the earthquake in Japan. And these are billions of euros losses in each case. 2 of the 5 biggest are floods. And please note that these countries are US, Canada, Europe, United States against China and Japan. So rich countries. Exposure is higher in these countries which are rich. So if flood is in Switzerland, it is something completely different compared to flood in some distant regions of a poor country. What are the causes of these losses and floods? Of course, development of floodplains, which is sometimes inevitable. In London, there are areas in flood risk, and still it is developed because demand for floods is incredible high there. So sometimes we have to live with flood risk, and we develop floodplains anyway. In Poland, we have also such cases, and in many countries as well. Another reason is welfare growth. The richer we are, the risk is bigger. That is the very maybe paradoxical issue, but that is true. And also we can mention climate change. So Nelson had the presentation on Monday also showing the impact of climate change of the water of flood risk in Poland. And as it revealed, it's not so easy to directly speak that climate change simply increases the flood risk. It would be simplistic to say this way. But anyway, the frequency, scale, seasonality, duration of floods, disturbances related to climate change, and can also increase the flood loss. And now I will go to my main topic, that is the flood risk governance paradigms. If we look at the flood risk governance on management, sometimes it is called, I will not discuss this issue, what is the difference between governance and management. Some months ago, there was a paper on that in Journal of Flood Risk Management, but it's not so important now. In short, these are the kind of heuristics we know and we use for dealing with floods. Flood risk governance paradigms consist of, so to speak, measures, and in fact there are 5 main ones. So flood risk prevention, which means not to inhabit the areas which are flooded. Very simple and most efficient way. It is of course related to planning. So indeed we have quite a well-developed maps, but everybody can see where this flood area and that is well done. However, to translate it into the decision making is very difficult because in Poland, local governments, they keep very well the control of their territory, and it needs to be decided eventually by local planners how to implement. I mean, the consequences of these maps, and that is the issue. Anyway, flood defense is the second measure. These are levies. Well, everybody knows what it is. Then we have flood risk mitigation, which we could see yesterday when we visited the place. So, for example, sealing doors to protect against the water coming in. That there are in England there are very sophisticated methods of mitigation. For example, removing the connection to electricity higher can avoid a lot of costs. So these are mitigation. Then we have flood preparation. That is the usually in Poland it is done by state fire brigades. The reaction when the flood actually happens. So the equipment, the sand, and whatever action required, and flood recovery related to the preparation in the financial sense and budgetal sense. And of course, historically, in the last 50 years, flood defense was the major had the major importance, and the rest, of course, were present, but not necessarily in equal importance. And paradigms, in the sense I'm talking about now, is the combination of these measures, and they are embedded in social context. So my thesis, and of course it is not mine, but from the literature, is that they cannot be treated as an independent decision of some specialists, but they are results of public discussions this way or the another. In some countries it is more developed, in some other countries more. I was in a team which prepared a paper on how public participation methods were used for implementation of flood risk directive in countries of Europe, and it was very interesting because the public participation methods were most developed in France, Poland, and one area in Spain. And in most of the countries it was almost absent or very superficially done. So it is one could see the kind of a national style how to deal with floods, and that is the social context, one of them. It includes social aims and objectives. So what the society wants, whether flood risk is an important issue. In the Netherlands, it's a matter of national importance, indeed, and it's obvious. But in some countries, it is not so much. And of course, developmental aspects. So how countries are wealthy. For several countries, like in Central Europe, the economic welfare is still an important objective. And we can trade this off for flood risk. Social values, so what people want, whether security is important for them, from risk and from other, or maybe unemployment, or nature protection, other values. Then knowledge, what we know, how well developed are our methods and models, and etc. Technology, what we have to our disposal. And I would roughly say that after the concrete, the second technology which is crucial for flood risk management is GIS, which is probably the second very important technology which is useful. And finally, the economy. Some countries have limited capacity to prepare for floods because simply they have other needs and the limited resources to spend on floods. Some are rich and can do it. So as I mentioned, that is a specific country, but at the same time very interesting. The beginning of the flood risk management in the current sense is the so-called Meiji era. That is the time when Japan decided to modernize itself, to open itself for ideas from the Western countries. And that was the time until the beginning of the 12th century when community-based flood mitigation measures were used, which are, for example, so-called Kasumi levies, And these were levees which are not protecting the whole areas, but rather that is this schematic presentation of these levees. And during the flood, so they rather were used for diverting the flood and the water flowing anyway, but in order to protect some valuable areas. And in fact, it is very much similar to nature-based solutions which are trying to implement nowadays. And there were some other like ring levees and just elevation of houses, which in several parts of the world is still very much used. Also here, just elevation of houses, as we saw yesterday, is a method. It is not anything new. Then we have next period, 1910 to 1935, modernization of Japan, which was a time of industrialization. Then the idea of discharge appeared. And the idea of discharge in the hydraulic sense, it was implemented in Japan from the Dutch engineers, which were introducing the modern development of hydrology in Japan. And there was also military needs for this water management and flood risk management, which I recalled at the beginning, and levees and dams started to be introduced. So not so long ago, about 100 years ago. In the historical sense, it's not a long time. And then we have closer to the third period, connected with the large economic jump of Japan. Japan, starting from being a relatively poor country, in fact, now it is one of the richest, and that happened in this 40, 50 years, when the economic growth was very high, urbanization was high, land use was dramatically changed, and that also involved large floods. Environmental pollution started to be a very important problem. You may remember from books the mercury problem in Japan, somewhere in the 70s, causing deaths of people, etc. And that was the time when dams were massively developed. Dams were used for flood risk management in much larger scale. And that was again because of the land use connected with economic growth, large floods, and possibility to build it. Some countries started to be bigger, more richer. Urban floods is the main issue now because of the growth of the metropolitan areas. Population decline, as previously Japan very quickly developed in the number of people, and now that is stagnated, and now is the population observed there. And that is another challenge because it's not anymore the risk for people, it is rather a risk for infrastructure. There are modern methods of flood risk management introduced, like safety standards, which are part of the policies and documents which are implemented. How it is now? So here we have the case when designated floods is accepted more and more. So in Japan also it is recognized that it is not possible and naive to think that we can avoid floods. In Japan, there is also opposition, and it's not only a pressure to demolish the one which exists, but also a growing opposition when the plan to build a new one is enforced. I presented Japan, but in fact, there are some papers also on other countries, on US, the Netherlands, also on Poland and other countries, and in fact, similar changes, these paradigm shifts, can be observed in many other countries. And they are driven by technology, is one, and economic factors too, but of course also the awareness, and several other reasons. There are, however, changes at certain time lag. So in the richest countries, developed countries, these changes happens earlier, and the less developed countries with certain time lag. There is also a wider context. I will not discuss it in details, but important how we change our views on flood risk management. First is the idea of integrated water resources management, which you surely know. More and more criticism towards defense. So building levees is much more criticized, and it is more difficult. And also, there are attempts to demolish them. In fact, there are not too many. But in Germany, there are some. In other countries, it appears difficult. In many cases, probably it's impossible. But in any way, defense is now the concrete and levees. This is the bad guy. So nobody easily defended. I mean, hydrologists try to, even if privately they support. Usually, the environmental aspect needs to be taken into consideration, which is from the hydrological point of view and modeling, etc., disturbance. Some 40 years ago, they had easier job. They didn't care too much about fish, vegetation, other issues, unless somebody was privately interested. That's of hydrologists, but usually they didn't have to. In terms of flood risk management, the reaction of the public is crucial. It can undermine even the best of more sophisticated idea. The idea of the resilience, which is coming from ecology, is also nowadays widely applied for flood risk management. It describes a system which can absorb perturbations, maintain its functions, and it has a capacity to resist, absorb, and recover, and to adopt and transform. So it is a flexible system, very much in line of the modern thinking on flood risk management. When we don't defend, because there would be only to resist, allows for certain disturbance, but to maintain the whole function. It somehow presumes certain flexibility that something may go wrong. So for example, flooded can happen, but could be controlled. In the Netherlands, there is an idea of compartmentalization, very difficult word, which is a designated flood for which goes first for the least valuable areas, and consequently for more and more if there is still the discharge. And as I mentioned, that is applied for flood risk management. And in terms of these 5 measures, perhaps flood recovery is the best. And there are such attempts already. Not to defend anything, better to save money. And if it happens, maybe next year, but maybe in 150 years, it can be economical not to do anything, because it's usually the work especially for structural protection is very expensive. So there are such ideas. Well, it is difficult from the perspective of the political implementation. People usually want protection, safety, security, but that is a solution. So what I mean is that it needs to be adjusted, the balance of these measures to particular conditions. And also adjusting measures to hazard exposure and vulnerability of the particular case. For example, urban and the rural distinction is very much important in this sense. There's a long discussion on the transfer of safety from the rural to urban areas and vice versa. What I'm talking about is a very, very general view. If you go into the details of the particular city location and you take into account what is there and how much money is, and how indebted is the local government, etc., all of these issues start to be much more complicated, of course. If we look at the current flat risk government paradigm, which have abandonment of hydraulic mission, they told hydrologists talk on that. So that is the mission that let the water flow. That is the rather old-fashioned thinking on separated look on the water. But now they try to look at the flat risk management in the holistic way. Second, nature-based solutions is something which is developed last few years, I think. Frankly speaking, there are not too many applications on the larger scale. Very small ones, of course, they are lovely usually. But when I talk to hydrologists and they think on the river basin scale, they don't see any chance for solutions on the larger scale. So then acceptance of floods is promoted as well. That is good in the sense that we are not naive, that we have the capabilities to protect against the floods. We cannot do it. That is obviously this is the matter of time, not next year, then 100 years later. Basin scale governance is now accepted almost everywhere, but still, for example, in Poland, we have, of course, administrative borders and the river basin borders are different, and it causes some disturbances. And public participation is something which slightly lasts 20 years. It has a major impact on how the flood risk management is conceived and implemented. What we have now and what we promote is not without controversies. First is collisions of paradigms. So still there are other paradigms. So sometimes they are called ecological, environmental friendly, but they are quite far from them, and in fact are quite represent the former paradigm of thinking about flood risk management. Then we have collisions within paradigms. So, for example, the one which we have now developing, the collision between environment protection and flood risk governance. That is something really interesting. Secondly, demand for development. That is, I think, more visible in this part of Europe, where demand for welfare is still high, and people still want to live in the better conditions, in separated, bigger flats, etc. And that is not always in line with flood risk management perspective. And conflicting societal demands and values. That is my occupation. So how people think about their life and how the society should be organized. In general, we could observe, that is a very general statement. I'm a little bit afraid to defend it, but development of individualization, so people want to live their own life and to, in accordance to their, so to speak, private values. And at the same time, flood risk management requires collective action, coordination. And that is more and more difficult. I'm happy I'm not implementing policies because there is a really headache to introduce this to the public and to organize it and to pay for it, etc. So that's something difficult. Finally, these are what I presented on the previous slide. So the short description of of the current flood risk management paradigm. But I finalizing my presentation, I would like to propose that we should think what happens next. That will not be definitely the solution for the flood risk management. We should think about the future development. And let me recall again the war example. It is a statement that generals always think about in terms of the previous war, past war. So that is, the new war is always an unexpected event. And we are in fact in the same position. So we are just focused on the nature-based solution, thinking that it is a solution, but eventually we are not prepared what happens further. First of all, climate change issues. I am very far from a direct attribution of climate change impact on the flood risk. And I think Nelson could support my statement. That is very much complicated. In some cases, climate change may even decrease the flood risk. So we need more knowledge indeed. No, it is not a general statement, but we need to clarify what is the impact. Secondly, exposure, growing welfare. I think we intuitively all think that the future will be better, that we will be more wealthy as societies and privately, but it can be not. Because COVID, it undermined the stability of the world system, and now the war. And finally, technologies. We may expect that could be a new technology which could be a breakthrough, helping us to deal with flood risk management. There is a lot of new ideas, especially with IT technologies and also others. It could help, perhaps, but of course we don't know. But with this, I would like to finish, leaving for your imagination what we could do further. Thank you very much.